Hello. So we just looked at some pre-Socratic philosophers, Heraclitus and Parmenides, and they both came to radically different opposing conclusions, but both using reason. Both built arguments with conclusions supported by reasonable premises. So Heraclitus, we saw, was an empiricist. He thought that the senses could give us knowledge about the world. And the senses tell us that the world is constantly in flux, constantly changing, even as there is an underlying order known as the logos behind it all. Parmenides rejects the senses as a way of acquiring knowledge. So he rejects what's given to the senses, and he uses pure reason to build a first premise that seems true and to make inferences from it, and comes to the exact opposite conclusion of Heraclitus, who says that the world is constantly in flux, and Parmenides uses reason alone to tell us that the world as we sense it as being in flux is an illusion, and the reality is that the world is uniform, unchanging, and unmoving. So we need a solution here. We have a philosophical problem. Is the world constantly changing, or is the world uniform and unchanging? So one possible solution to this is skepticism. That we see here that reason has been used to give us two exactly opposite conclusions. So the sophists are philosophers who essentially thought that reason could not be used to give us metaphysical truths. And this is exactly why. We can use reason to come up with any conclusion that we like. So the sophists decided to use reason for practical ends, to give up the search for truth, and to rather use reason to build cases for, let's say, your innocence if you're arguing, in court, or if you're running for an office, to use reason to make the case that people should vote for you. So they think that instead of searching for truth, as Heraclitus and Parmenides were doing, reason should be used for practical ends. So Socrates, who is the teacher of Plato, is highly critical of the sophists because he is concerned fundamentally with the truth. And he thinks that the examined life is the one worth living. In other words, the life that investigates the nature of the world, the nature of justice, the nature of ethics and right and wrong, the nature of knowledge, that we should be always searching for truth. And Plato is a student of Socrates and completely convinced by this. Socrates never wrote anything down during his lifetime, so we have an account of Socrates through the works of Plato, who wrote in dialogues. So Socrates is a main character in Plato's writings. So Plato doesn't want to resort to skepticism. Plato wants to solve the problem proposed by Heraclitus and Parmenides by thinking about reality in a different way. And so Plato's solution is to say that reality is dualistic. In other words, there's a divided line, and the senses have a role and a place, and reason and intellect has a role and a place in the makeup of the world. So we have the senses, which give us defective copies of what reason gives us. This puts Plato in the rationalist camp, though he's not dismissive completely about the senses. There's certainly a hierarchy here where the intelligible realm gives us access to timeless, eternal, objective truths. And he refers to the objects of the intelligible realm as concepts, ideas, or forms. Forms is an important word for Plato. So to give you an example, the area of a triangle is timeless. It's eternal. It was discovered and it's never changed. We still calculate the area of a triangle the same way that the Greeks did today. And 1,000 years from now, people will still calculate the area of a triangle in the same way. So a geometric truth, like the area of the triangle, would be a form, okay? And it is, like I said, timeless, eternal, and it doesn't matter what your culture says about it or what you personally believe. There's a truth to the matter, okay? And the sensible realm would be, let's say, the idea of the triangle drawn out. So I draw a triangle there, and if you look closely, you'll find that the lines are not completely straight and the angles aren't perfect. And you'll see that it is essentially a defective copy of the form of the triangle, okay, which exists in the mind. And we understand the triangle in the mind, and then we do our best to depict it, but we necessarily depict it in a defective way. Okay, so this dualistic reality is very well articulated in Plato's Allegory of the Cave, which I'm going to talk about now. So in the Allegory of the Cave, and I'm posting a video of it in the module so you can get a visual look at it, but I'm going to try to draw it for you here. Look at all these whiteboards that I have. It's amazing. In the Allegory of the Cave, essentially you have a cave with an opening, and along the perimeter you have prisoners, okay, and they are sitting, and they're shackled, and they're sitting right next to each other, and they can't move their bodies, and this is the only life they've ever known. Let's suppose they were in prison from the very start, and all that they see, well, let's rewind a bit, and behind them, something that they don't see is a fire, okay, and an elevated pathway, and on that elevated pathway we have people moving. They're carrying animals. Here's a really bad camel, and they're carrying goods and so on. So what's happening is, as people are traveling along this elevated pathway, the fire is casting a shadow on the cave wall. Okay, so they see a shadow of the person on the wall, and the camel, the really badly drawn camel on the wall. Now, Plato is asking us to consider, if you were shackled and all you could see were these shadows, wouldn't you take those shadows to be reality? Okay, and sure enough, it seems like we would. And when people are talking on this elevated pathway, wouldn't we associate those noises with those shadows that we take to be real? So people will form beliefs, especially as the prisoners start talking to each other, and they'll start forming beliefs on the basis of incomplete information. Okay, so then Plato has us think about a prisoner who is released. So the shackles are taken off, and they are allowed to turn around and see the world as it is, not the world as it's cast as a shadow. And he describes the initial response of that prisoner as being in pain, because what is being called to question are all their fundamental beliefs about the world. They're recognizing that they were all based on a fiction. And so that is a painful process. And sure enough, philosophy can be a sort of painful experience. And he thinks that prisoner who's released will immediately want to run back and sort of put back on its chains and just look at the shadows and be comfortable with the world that he knows. So the prisoner needs to be forcibly dragged out of the cave, and from there, the prisoner's eyes are burning as he sees the sun for the first time. But what he is essentially seeing here is the world as it actually is, okay? Not the world as a defective copy of what is. And then he thinks the prisoner will come to appreciate and love the understanding of the world as it is, and will want to run back and tell all his old friends about what was going on there. Okay. Now, thinking about the symbolism of the allegory of the cave, let's look at a chart here. These are divisions of understanding. Okay. And we're starting from the bottom and we're moving to the top being the highest form. Okay. So at the bottom we have conjecture. Okay. And that is represented by shadows. Okay. And images, reflections, okay, of reality. And that's essentially the shadow cast upon the wall that that the prisoners initially see. Then they start talking to each other, and they start forming beliefs. Okay, and that's where they start understanding the shadows and the images as things and as objects. So you no longer have the shadow of the camel, but you talk to one another and you all collectively agree based on your senses and what you've seen. You agree that that shadow is a camel, and you agree that that noise is the noise made by the camel. Okay, so this realm right here is the sensible realm. This is given to us by the senses, and at the most basic level, the immediate sense data of the shadow, and then when people start talking, belief, but still belief based on what everyone has seen. Well, then we move into the intelligible realm, and this is where the divided line occurs. And from here, we get the forms of science and math. Okay. You know what? I'm sorry. I should have put that in the objects box. Okay. So we get basically this is the realm of understanding, and we get the forms of science and math. Okay. So in the Meno, which you can read in our textbook, Socrates ushers a slave into the intelligible realm by teaching that slave a geometric proof. Okay, so the argument is that anyone can be led towards the understanding, and at its most basic level, it occurs in the forms of science and math, because you can teach someone fairly easily an axiom of geometry and get them to accept proof of geometry. Okay, but then at the highest level, we have reason. Okay, and that's where you have the higher forms. And it's at that point where you start making inferences based on what you know. So you start using reason to behold, not only scientific and mathematical proofs, which are sort of insular. You have to accept founding axioms and derive, truths off of them. But you start making connections. So, as part of the allegory, the released slave starts experiencing the sun, but then starts making inferences about the sun's relation to the earth and how weather patterns work and things like that. That's where you use reason to learn more and more, and you discover the higher forms. And for Plato and Socrates, the higher forms involve forms of justice and ethics. Okay. All right. And of course, email me if you have any questions about this, and I will post related information in our module.